You have heard that it was said of to them of old, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whosoever is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment, and whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council, and whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire.
Welcome to Analog Catholic. My name is Ben, and here with me we have
Rob,
nice. What are we talking about this week, Robert?
uh, today, oh gosh, what's happening? Okay. Instead of my computer speaking up. Today we're going to be talking about violence. Violence in movies and television, violence in music, violence in our hearts. We talk about
Music was a
violence.
good idea. We
I
didn't talk
know,
about music
I
before.
know.
That's a great idea.
I came to mind as I was singing. I was like, you know what? There's violent music lyrics too. So like maybe we should talk about that. No, yeah, we're talking about violence today. Violence in media, really in general. It's one of those things that's been around as long as I've been alive in terms of media. I mean, we watch old media prior to when you and I were born, and there's still violence in a lot of things. It's just a gratuitous violence sometimes. Sometimes it's subtle violence, but there's always, well, I mean, not every single thing has violence, but there's always been violence in media, I guess is what I should say. So it's less of, oh wow, this new thing has occurred in our culture where violence is permissible, and more like this new thing has occurred where violence is so casual. It's just like there, and it just you can just be so gratuitous with it nowadays, and it's just expected almost. Um, but yeah, let's start with because I think if we just gotta do a general like, oh, violence thing, we'll kind of go off track a little bit. Um, Violence in like movies and television. What are your what are your thoughts? Do you think there's too much violence nowadays? You think there's not enough violence? What do you what do you think?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Well, I don't know what you mean by nowadays. Um, but in things I've been exposed to,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say there's certain things that I'm used to that I shouldn't be.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it's like that's real life. Um, because you see stuff and you're like, that's upsetting. I don't know. So I guess I don't watch really anything with intense violence in it, or at
Yeah.
least I haven't in some time. Um, what I'm connecting to is I watched a show this week where somebody like their ulcer burst or whatever
Yep.
in the show, and they like vomited up blood, and that was like, whoa, like I was like that, and I don't know if that's violent. Um, but there is a sense to, yeah, I think a lot of stuff just shows you things that you wouldn't see in your day-to-day life if TV didn't exist, right?
Mhm.
Like you just see things that should be very upsetting and you see a lot of them and you see them every day. And prior to the existence of TV, you either never saw them or you saw them like once in your life, or if you were like in World War II, you saw them, right? Like, but
Yeah.
it just wouldn't be stuff that
Yeah.
a regular person would see. And so then we're desensitized to it. I think that's it, like a valid thought.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Is like how bad is that? Well, it depends what it is, I
Yeah,
guess.
I appreciate that you started with like a medical issue as violence because I think it's a good way to like segue into a distinction situation here, right? Like, okay, you said it's like someone's ulcer or like had an ulcer issue and so they vomited up blood. Like, is that violent? Like, yeah, I think that's violent in a really broad sense, but I don't know if that's what I was thinking about when I think about violence because it's like a medical an issue. But like you're sort of making a point of too of like that's still something you just wouldn't have necessarily been exposed to unless it happened to you or someone in front of you in real life, which would be super rare. Um,
Right. And to be exposed to it would be traumatic,
right.
right?
Like you'd be
Outside
like,
of
holy
television.
crap, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Um, so I kind of, yeah, I like that you went with that direction first because when I think of violence, I mean, I'm thinking of like explicit violence, like harm being caused to another person. Um, and For me, so this is like super interesting because I grew up really with like no media restrictions at all, no censorship at all. And so I just saw things, watched things, Um, and there was violence in a lot of the media that I consumed. And so for me, there was, I guess the point I'm trying to get at when I say like, oh, nowadays is the violence I saw before was, yes, it was violent, but there was always like a limit to the violence, I guess I would say. Like there was a limit to the gratuity of the violence. And now, I mean, I don't watch the shows. I've seen some clips that have popped up in like front of me because of social media, or I've even had some friends who watch the shows tell me about it, and even they're kind of turned off, and they're not even necessarily like Catholic or anything, like my friends. They're just like, oh, I don't even want to watch this. Like this is over the top and gross. Um, but there's this sense now. All right, well, let me try to clarify like this. When I was younger, and there would be violence in movies and stuff, it was like someone getting shot and they just like collapse and die. Nowadays, it's someone gets shot and they're explicitly shot in the head and like their head explodes like a grape. Like that's the trend, the trajectory that it's gone, and that I've noticed is it's gone from just like these either implications of violence or the violence was kind of muted into this, unless you were watching something explicitly gory like a horror film. Um, but now you don't even have to be watching that to get gore. Like it just happens. It's just there. It's almost like the default. And I wonder why. Is it because we've hit a point of saturation of violence in the media where now you have to get to that point to start getting people to be, you know, shocked and surprised nowadays? There's a horror series out now. I want to make sure I get the name right. I think it's Terrifier. Have you heard of this? Yeah, Terrifier. And it's got like a
No, I haven't.
clown. All right, yeah, I've never seen them. They don't appeal to me. I'm not a big slashy, gory horror guy anyway. So it didn't really appeal to me to begin with. But I'm even less inclined to watch it now because it's basically known for just like obscene gore. Like that's the whole, like that's its shtick, you know? And I had a friend who, again, just like it's not like he's Catholic and cares about whatever that he's seeing on media, like whatever media he consumes. Like he's not super like into that kind of stuff or like, the whatever you want to call it, like custody of eye, stuff like that. But even he's telling me, he's like, the movies are bad. They're so bad because the entire point of the movie is just to be nothing but like the grossest gore they could produce. Um, and I'm like, okay, if we're getting to the point where like someone who, like, as a rule, doesn't really care about quote unquote violence in media is saying, hey, this is like ridiculous. I feel like we're getting to a point now where what are we doing with this? Are we trying to normalize this violence? Are we trying to make it like an acceptable artistic expression? Like you're trying to validate yourselves as like, no, 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 like I can be a great director and like produce all this violence. Like it's totally um valid as an artistic expression of media. I don't know. But that's just like something that I've noticed is it's just we've gone from violence as an almost like unfortunate reality in movies. And I'm going to exclude horror from this because horror has always explicitly been about violence. So we could talk about maybe horror separately if you want to. But otherwise, it's always been like, oh, violence is such like this unnecessarily, not unnecessarily, this unfortunate um, reality in our movies. And sometimes it's gory, sometimes it's not. And nowadays, I feel like it's just, oh, and violence is going to be in our movies. We're going to make it realistic and gory. Like that's just the trend I'm seeing. And television shows do this too because there's been, with the advent of streaming, your typical television like restrictions in terms of what you can depict have basically been thrown out the window. Um, so now a lot of these new popular shows being made are essentially being made without any restriction on what they can depict. Um, and now, yeah, you just have even more violence than like your average, you know, show. I don't know. Yeah, those are
That's
my
interesting.
yeah my thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
that I haven't thought of that. Of it's no longer like TV is sort of this public thing, and so you have to like shape your TV show to fit into the restrictions. It's like you can have a TV show that's rated like TV mature or whatever the mature ratings are,
Mhm.
and it just be like, well, if you shouldn't watch it, don't watch it.
Yeah.
Versus in the like, yeah, back in the day, it was like everything was sort of kind of considered public, and so you had to restrict it. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, the first, I'm like, I was trying to like find the scene on YouTube. I can't find it, but the first PG-13 movie I watched, um, I wasn't supposed to watch it, but I
Oh
think it
my
was at my
goodness.
grandmother's house. Uh, and she had a VHS of, have you seen Dragonheart?
No, I don't think I
It's
have.
this movie about, I don't even remember. It's a dragons primarily, but I
Yeah.
think like early in the movie there's this scene where this guy like rips his heart out or something. I don't know.
Oh my
There's some
gosh.
scene where like like his heart is stabbed or something. I
Mhm.
think there's this thing where they like take a piece of the dragon's heart and put it in a human or the other way around to make the human and the dragon like live forever or something. I don't know. The point is, I saw this scene of a dragon or a human, I think a human's heart being ripped open,
Yeah.
and I was like traumatized. It freaked me out.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was trying to find the scene to be like, does it still freak me out? I don't know. Um, but it's like things like that that like I think that should be scary to see somebody's chest opened.
Yeah.
Um, obviously it might not have been as realistic as I remember it being, but even in the sense like this movie came out in the 90s, even in the sense that if it wasn't realistic, the fact that it would still be traumatizing, like that's how it should be, I think. Because just like the concept, I don't know. But I guess at that point it's more of like the imagination if it's not realistic.
Mhm.
I don't know. But it is like that exists. Like I think of this with like violence and then like I think we're gonna talk about like nudity and like that kind of thing
Yeah.
in movies. Like there's a way in which those things I think used to exist more, and I think today still exist to some extent in TVs and movies that like they exist because they like kind of have to serve the plot, right?
Mhm.
Like if there's like somebody has to be killed in this scene, so we're going to do it in a way that seems realistic, but we're not going to like overemphasize things or like make things like show you too much, but like this is part of the story. Same thing with like sex scenes and things like that of
Yeah.
like there's a way you can do it which it's like we're not going to like show you things but like this is a part of the story
Mhm.
that we're telling and so we like can show you like tell you that it happens in a visual way that's not like gratuitous.
Yeah.
um but then yeah like you're saying like I think a lot of like new television and movies that I've seen like seem to like yes lean on these things more than they lean on the plot. Here's an example that I did see recently that I thought of as you were talking. I saw the movie Snowpiercer. Have you seen
Yeah.
this?
I haven't seen it, but I know what movie it is. Yeah.
um it's this like dystopian movie. Everybody lives on a train, and
Yep.
yeah, it came out somewhat recently, within the past 5 to 10 years. And I remember seeing the trailers when it came out and being like, that looks stupid.
Mhm.
And then something I saw like a review or something in the past few months, and I was like, maybe I'll watch that. And so my wife and I watched it um, within the past couple weeks, and it was like, yeah, there was some like wild violence moments. It was just like very gory, a lot of just like fighting and killing each other. And it wasn't good. Like it wasn't a good movie. We didn't enjoy it. And it did feel like very like at the violent moments, like we want to show you all of like the rawness of these people being like sliced up.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it just didn't the plot, yeah, it just felt so dumb. And then I looked up some reviews. It doesn't have like great reviews. But like people liked it. Like people liked the movie. And I'm like, I don't like it has a 94% rating on Rotten Tomatoes,
Oh my
which I
gosh.
guess is not the but point is like it emphasized the violence so much and it feel like the plot was just like kind of thrown together to like connect all these scenes that kind of just looked scandalized. Like it was just like they were trying to like, yeah, I don't know. It wasn't good. Um, oh, it's rated R. I didn't even know that. We shouldn't have watched it then. Um, but yeah, so I think it was like something like that. I was like, wow, this is what people like, but it felt like the point of the movie was to show violence. Um, and the plot existed like to serve that versus the other way around. The point of the movie is to like tell a story, and the violence exists when necessary to serve the story.
I use this show as a bellwether for a lot of this stuff. So The Sopranos, when it came out, right, came out in 1999. It lasted until 2006, 2007, I think. Um, when it came out, it was significant because of a couple of things. One, it depicted violence and nudity to a degree not really comic. It was like, because even though it was on HBO, HBO hadn't quite yet gotten itself the reputation it has nowadays, where you almost expect nudity in all of their shows. And so when I watched Sopranos, um, and I'm watching it through the lens of today, where there's a lot of retrospection on like, oh, The Sopranos was pushing the limits on violence and sex and TV. And I actually watched the show and I'm like, this is nothing compared to what we get nowadays. Like the violence on Sopranos is like I was saying, like a couple guys get shot, there might be a little bit of blood, and that's basically it. The first episode there's a little bit more explicit, but it's not as explicit going forward, except for a couple times. And I'm like, this was supposed to be, 25 years ago, this was violence. This was, oh my gosh, look how much violence there is on this show. Nowadays, if a show came out with that much violence, you would think, wow, they really pulled back. They really tamed themselves compared to some other shows. Um, there's a show I'm watching now, and I've debated stop like not watching it. Um, called Invincible. It's a it's like a superhero show on Amazon. It's based off a comic. And there's nothing, at least from my experience, there's nothing like sexual in it at all, and there's some swearing. But there are some depictions of like gratuitous violence in it because it's like the whole thing is like, oh, we're superheroes and like we're gonna show you what it really looks like, because everyone's so used to Superman punching someone and like nothing really happens. Um, and I'm like, this is like crazy. Where are we getting this from? This idea that the focus of the story is subversion of the superhero genre. Like, oh, we have to show violence. Like, we have to do this because if we're not realistic, quote unquote, then we're not doing good work. We're not doing good art. Um, and it reminds me of. I'm just like really using this to like to vent some critiques here. It reminds me of George R. R. Martin, who wrote the Song of Ice and Fire series, right? Game of Thrones. The show was based off it, and I read the books that are out like a long time ago, like 10 years ago, and there's a lot of violence in them, a lot of sex in them. And when you listen to his interviews, he's like, "Oh, this is just how reality is." Like that's why he does it. He's like, "This is what's real. This is what it was really like." And he critiques like Tolkien and Lord of the Rings because he thinks they're not real. 'Cause he thinks like like Tolkien was afraid to engage with like reality of like, oh, actually everyone's violent, or like actually there's like in war there's mass rape, or there's just yeah these like disgusting amounts of violence and brutality, and it's all unapologetic and it's natural and it's gonna happen, and no one's a good person. Everyone's just an actual animal, like waiting for an excuse to be an animal, right? It's a very cynical, jaded view, and I see that as like the primary motivator behind a lot of these depictions of violence and stuff in movies and television is this cynical idea of like this is real or this is more real. Like if I'm depicting violence, I'm depicting reality. Um, because there's the accusations that things are sanitized, like, oh, like this isn't violent enough, this isn't really how it would be, or these whatever X, Y, or Z sins that are occurring, like, are the natural state of things, and if you're not depicting it, you're not being honest with your audience. And I don't think that's necessarily true. First off, I don't need things to be realistic in the media that's being depicted. That's not the point of media, believe it or not. Uh, and then two, I just don't think even if you are trying to depict reality, you need to do so in a way where you have gratuitous violence and sex. Like a lot of things can be implied to have occurred off screen, And I think if you're a decent enough writer and director, you can make that look well. But that's, yeah, another little mini right there about how comparing 25 years ago, cutting edge, not cutting edge, but um, envelope pushing, genre defining violence, and now comparing it to for television. I would say for television because there was like gangster movies that came out before that were just as violent, but like for television, things weren't that violent yet. Um, to nowadays where it's like way more casual, happens way more often. This is a good point. The rating for that show Invincible is like TV 14, but the violence, I'm baffled that it's TV 14 with the amount of violence in it and like the gratuity of the violence in it because that's insane. Like I feel like that alone should make it a TVMA or something. But
Yeah, I do think ratings have shifted, um, and that's yeah probably related um, to these things. Here's a thought. I know you might have criticisms and compliments of Lord of the Rings movies in general, but do you think the Lord of the Rings movies are gratuitously violent at any point? And if so, or if not, like what makes the different? Like what's different about it? Because there is killing and there is
yeah,
fighting, a lot of that in Lord of the
there's
Rings.
no, there was no, this from what I can remember, there's no dismemberment in Lord of the Rings. There's no dismemberment. There's no, I'm trying to remember. I don't think there's explicit depictions of blood either. I think people just like, they just like have people look like they're falling down from getting hit with a sword. Um, I'm
Yeah, I
trying to think
think
of, is it, I don't, there might be some like orc blood,
yeah, I think there's
but
like orc blood splatter, and then
yeah,
where there is human blood, it's not like blood splatter from an attack. It's like there's blood on his face because he wasn't like attacked, kind of thing.
yeah. So that's the thing. Yeah. So that depiction of violence, I don't look at that and think, oh, that's not how it really would go, or like that's not realistic. It doesn't take me out of the movie at all. I'm in the movie. I'm invested in the movie because the characters are good, the story's good, the art direction's good, the cinematography's good, the sound direction's good. Like the movies are well crafted. They're very well done. I don't care that it's not violent. I don't care that I don't see men like with missing limbs or like having like their eyes stabbed or like you know beheaded or whatever. Like I don't need that. And honestly, you don't need to show it. Like you can just imply it and it could be just as effective. Um, so I don't know like what's the point of arguing for a realistic depiction of battle? Um, I'll see critiques online of people saying of like seeing medieval style battles or ancient battles, and they'll say that's not how it would have done, that's not how they would have done it, that's not how it would have been. That's one thing. But to say like, oh, it's not violent enough, that's not how realistic it is violence. I'm like, do we need it to be that violent though? I guess that's the question really. If you wanted to pick something and you wanted to pick something honestly and truthfully, does that mean you also need to honestly and truthfully depict gratuitous violence in that?
Yeah, um, yeah. Like I guess just off the top of my head too, like comparing even just like Snowpiercer that I saw a few weeks
Mhm.
ago with Lord of the Rings, like there is a yeah, like there are moments in like a lot of moments in Snowpiercer where my wife and I were like, we can't, like we can't look at this. Like this is
Yeah.
like making us uncomfortable. And I don't think
Hmm.
of any moments
Hmm.
where that happened in Lord of the Rings.
No, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where it's like they show in theory the same thing, like somebody being killed with a sword.
Yep.
But there's a difference in the way it's shown. I guess I don't I maybe would have to see them side by side to describe exactly what it is. But like yes, it seems more gratuitous in something like Snowpiercer, and you're like,
Yeah.
this is like I don't want to watch this. Versus, I think I think something that comes to mind is like spoiler alert for those that haven't read or seen Lord of the Rings, like Boromir dying,
Yeah.
or like what's his name, one of the elves from Lorien, he dies at Helm's Deep.
Oh.
Um,
Yeah, well, I gotta remember. I don't remember. I can't remember his name on top of my
like the
head.
fr he was like he was an
Yeah, yeah,
important
yeah,
guy. Um, but like he dies, he gets like stabbed from behind. It's like we're getting into details here. He gets stabbed from behind, and I think he like coughs up a little bit of blood. Like I think it is like kind of somewhat shown, but like not in a way that's like I have to cover my eyes, and more a way that's like, oh wow, like that's sad. Like it
yeah.
evokes emotion without being like too much like disgust or discomfort.
Yeah.
So I think there is a line. I guess I don't know exactly where to show it, but I think a cinematographer would be able to have this conversation in more depth.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. What is even the line for violence? You know, that's such a it's such an open-ended question that anyone can have an opinion on, where you'll get some people who will just say no violence. Like there shouldn't be any violence depicted on television, and you'll get some people that say, well, some violence is fine, or, other people will say some gore is fine, and then yeah, it's just a mess. Um,
So, like, what do you think, I guess, from like a moral perspective?
mhm.
Like, what should we or should we not be exposing ourselves to in terms of violence in movies and television?
That's a great question. I think really, I again, this is like hard to say. I don't want to say no violence at all, but I think I do want to say low violence. Um, I think if violence is depicted, it's not inherently bad, but I think it's how it's depicted and then how it's treated. Because another thing I've picked up in some media, contemporary media, is a lot of the violence is like revenge driven. There's this idea of like the person deserves to be horrifically violated and like whatever because they're a bad person or because they like wronged the protagonist or just like there's like some excuse to justify the amount of violence done to the person. And there's always a sense of like, justice is done. Like this person was bad, and now they're like they've received justice for their whatever sins they've committed against someone else. But I think we're running into two problems with that. One is the idea that justice is an unequal virtue, meaning you're allowed to do whatever you want to someone because they've wronged you, and it's justified. Like that's not true. Um, if someone, I don't know, cuts you off in the road and like, cuts you off when you're driving, like you're not justified to then kill the person. That's not equal justice to like rectify, that wrong. Um, and then two, it devalues the dignity of the person. So we as Christians, right, like we're called to like one of the corporal works of mercy is bearing the dead. Like there is an inherent aspect of our faith that says like the dead need to be respected. Um, and so a lot of that sort of violence to me is like a disrespect of the dead because people usually die pretty quickly comparatively. And so what else are you gonna do after the fact? You know, a lot of what they're doing after the fact is like disfiguration of a corpse or stuff like that, or just like gratuitous overkill. And it's like that's not right, that's not dignified. Um, and so we're getting this twofold approach to, in my mind at least, like the contemporary depiction of violence, which is mostly revenge based, and the idea that it's justified to do these things because you're getting revenge or because you're avenging someone else. And I think what we're running into now with this contemporary cultural depiction of violence is it's justified if we find it to be justified, meaning we're the judges, right? We're the judge, we're the jury, we're the executioner. And sometimes, you know, like you watch an action movie from the 70s or 80s, you're like, heck yeah. Like I love that Judge Dredd is judge, jury, and executioner. You know, that's awesome. Like these are really bad people, and he's just like administering justice. But nowadays, it's not even like as clear cut. Like again, like I said, nowadays it's just if the person has slighted the protagonist and it's depicted as like this cartoonishly big jerk, it's justified for the protagonist to do whatever they want to that person. I'm like, that's insane. Like that's not how morality works. It's not like how justice works. And then like again, like there's an honor, unspoken honor between combatants. I'll go, let's like get on my little soapbox here again, where there should be like respect after the fact. Like if you defeat someone in battle or in war, like there should be a respect for the dead, respect for the deceased. It was hugely scandalous in the Iliad, going way back here. We've had this problem for thousands of years, going way back. In the Iliad, and spoiler, when Achilles defeats Hector and drags his body behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. Like that was massively scandalous. Like that wasn't depicting Achilles as like, oh, he's so justified because, you know, Hector had killed I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but like Achilles is his close friend. You know, like oh, like nowadays that would be depicted. That'd be depicted as like the just thing. It'd be like, oh, look how much satisfaction we're deriving from justice being administered to this person for killing our protagonist's friend. And you know, but that's not how it's supposed to be depicted. You're not supposed to think, oh yeah, Achilles is justified here. You're supposed to think, oh man, Achilles is just messed up. Like he has just violated so many rules of honor and war, and he's violated the honor of the gods. Like this is gonna come back and bite him in the butt, you know. Um, and so there's just yeah, this is this undignified approach to human life in violence. And I don't think all aspects of violence or all depictions of violence are necessarily that because again, like if you're watching like a mob show or a mob movie and a mobster like puts a hit out on someone, you're not it's not like, oh wow, that's so cool. I love seeing someone getting killed. But it's just that's how the mob works. That's how it is, but it's usually a pretty simple like couple shots to the chest and maybe there's some blood and that's it. But it's not depicted as like a good thing. You know, it's like, oh, these are all criminals doing criminal things. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think I'm losing my train of thought here. But at that point, the point I'm trying to make is if the violence doesn't respect one, human dignity, which sounds like funny, 'cause it's like, oh, how can violence ever respect human dignity? I think it can in cases, but whatever. If it doesn't like respect it, at least post fact, and then the justification of the act, I think I'm more concerned with. So I'm more concerned with justifying violence that's not actually supposed to be justified than I am with like violence occurring, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that does make sense. And then like the way it's shown, like I guess another like in like this may be a whole other can of worms, as they say. Um, but like how do we like a similar thing of like violence being shown or justified in a you know poorly justified or shown too much.
Mhm.
Like does that apply to like literature as well? Like you're thinking of like the Iliad, like the dead body being dragged, or like that makes me think of like the end of the Odyssey where Odysseus like kills all the people that were trying to get with his wife. Um, and then I think some like of the servants too. And it's just like he like kills like 100 people or something.
Yeah.
Like there's just like this very like he
Yeah.
kills all these people, but it's not like described. But like, how do we think about that? Like, is that redeemable? Like that type of description? Because I wouldn't say like, I mean, it's been a while, but I
Yeah.
wouldn't say like the way it's described in the Odyssey is like upsetting.
Yeah.
But the concept is like he just killed a whole bunch of people.
Yeah. And I think that's where like the type of media we use, the medium we use is always interesting because when you read it, it's just, oh yeah, like Odysseus killed like 100 people. And you're just like, well, yeah, they were all trying to steal his wife from him so that he was justified, right? Like even still then, there's this aspect of justification in his action. And where I'm not even here to argue his justification either. I'm just saying like that's part of the motivation. Um, but it's like very different because if you depicted that, I think there's Christopher Nolan's working on an Odyssey movie, I think, that might come out like in a year or two. So like, how is it going to be depicted in that movie? You know, is it just, oh, he just like shoots them with an arrow and they just kind of collapse, or is he going to like hack them all to pieces? You know, and like make it a big display and like justify that by like, oh, they're trying to steal my wife from me. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think it's easy. I think that's why violence was able to percolate in our medium for so long because there's no clear cut moral line unless you would just go complete cold turkey and just say no violence at all. You know, I
Yeah.
I think if you say you can permit some violence, you're just no one's going to be able to really find a good point to agree on for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable um, in that violence.
Yeah. And I guess like it's easier to say like no nudity at all than it is to say no violence at all. Right.
Yeah,
Like that's probably where there's
yeah.
like that just makes more sense. Versus
I
violence does seem like it for like a proper story, like a proper adventure story, there's always like some type of violence, or usually is like some level of violence that needs
Mhm.
to exist.
Yeah, he usually uses like a vehicle for the conflict to drive the plot. Violence is somehow related to it. But
Right.
I think this is a good segue. I think we have two more topics really want to get over. One is why violence and not sex, um, like in sense of permissibility and like mainstream culture. And then the second one is violence and entertainment, like UFC and stuff like that. So let's go into that.
All right, let's talk about sex in movies first. Um, yeah. I guess an important thing too is like, I don't know how important it is, but like, is there an extent to which like one should be exposed to like sexual things or sexual reference in movies
Mhm.
or TV shows? Like, what do you think of that?
Um, huh. I think as opposed to violence, I think there's clear standards of like what could be acceptable and not acceptable. And I think we need to be more on guard against sexual depictions in media because I don't know if I'm gonna articulate this well, but let me take a shot at this. When it comes to sexual depictions on media, it's an immediate gratification of okay, I'm gonna screw these up. Concupiscible appetite. Um, so it immediately triggers something within us, like of desire. Um, and that is a trigger for all sorts of things, like sin especially. But it's very real. Like you can't not have real sexual depictions of things, right? Like you can't not have real nudity because what does fake nudity look like? If it's nudity, it's nudity. Um, you can have artistic expression. We think about old medieval Renaissance era paintings, like there's usually women depicted naked, but you wouldn't say like that's pornographic. You wouldn't say it's inappropriate. You would say like, oh, it's just like an artistic expression. Like maybe, yeah, we have that clear cut. This is pure art. It's just to admire the form, but not the what's wrong for it? The matter, I guess. Um, Whereas in television and movies, you don't really have that. There really is no just like artistic depiction of nudity in media. Um, Photography, maybe, I've definitely heard that argument of like people taking sexually explicit photos for the sake of photography, like artistic expression of photography. Um, but in terms of like depictions in television and movies, it just doesn't serve a point outside of that. Yeah, you could get nudity in non-sexual contexts in media, medical reasons. I think um, some shows or movies I've been surprised because like there's no nudity at all, and then maybe it's like a cop or like there's police related things, and so they go to the morgue and they pull out a deceased woman, and like all of a sudden like it's just like a naked body, and you're just like, oh, that just like came out of nowhere because there hasn't been any nudity at all. You weren't expecting nudity, but because it's like depicting a dead body, it kind of gets around um, some of the previous censors. And so it's like, all right, well, that's hopefully not a sexual depiction, but you have to wonder, like, okay, what's the standard here for depiction? I think the standard is pretty clear, or a lot more clear with sexual depiction than violent depiction, and that's don't do it. Like, there's no need to depict nudity in a sexual way. There's no reason to depict sexual encounters in any sort of way or any kind of sexual content. Um, it's not plot serving. It's it's sensual serving. It's there to serve the senses of the audience to get them to watch what you're depicting, to get them to like keep paying attention to what you're putting on screen. Um, and I think for a lot of things, it's used as a crutch. Um, we don't have that with violence because with violence, a lot of the depictions are uncommon. Um, Sort of like what you were saying about the vomiting blood from the ulcer. Like there's no that's rare. Like you're not going to experience that normally. That's not like a thing you have an immediate response to because you're just like, what the heck's happening? Um, Whereas with sexuality, it's like, yeah, everyone knows what that is. That's like an intrinsic part of our being. Um, like we know there's a desire there for this thing. And we know that we can entice a desire through visual depictions of nudity or just like sexual acts. Um, so I think they just play on, I think violence and sex, when depicted in front of us, play on different parts of our passions. And when it comes to violence, there's okay, like this is happening. It is what it is. I don't care. Maybe it's too gory, maybe it's too explicit, maybe there's just like a lot of it, and that's like bad taste, so to speak. Like it's almost like an aesthetic critique of the situation. Whereas with nudity, it's just like as soon as you see it, like literally something activates in your brain. Um, and like there's a draw to it, an attraction to it, and like it actually like physiologically changes things. Like it's the um, same stuff behind pornography. And so violence, I think you can argue like people can argue for days about what's appropriate level of violent depictions in media. But I think when it comes to sexual depictions, you just can't have it. You just can't do it. Because they're touching on two
Yeah.
different parts of the person, and the little bit of sex is going to go a long way. Where like a little bit of violence, you'll probably forget about like 30 seconds later. You know.
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, important distinction between those two. Um, yeah, and like you can show and or tell um that like two characters engaged in sex without like really showing anything, right? Like you can like
Mhm.
imply it very easily and move on. Like it doesn't have to be shown. And so like if the story creator deems that that's necessary for the story, you can do it in a way that is not, yeah, gratuitous and doesn't show anything.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And it's yeah, it is like the only reason that would exist is yeah, the same reason that pornography exists. Like it exists to like address those desires in like a very immoral way. And so like it
Yep.
doesn't need to happen. Um yeah. I'm right now I'm reading a book for book club that I run
Yeah.
with some friends that my wife and I run and we read the books together. Um and there's this like transition into two characters um, engage in sexual things. But it's like it's just implied. Like it describes that they kiss, and then like the chapter ends, and then the next chapter describes like the story continuing. But it's like clear, okay, like we know what happened. We didn't need you to describe it. We understand what happened. Like yeah, and you just like move on, and it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Um, that yeah, like it's an easy way to do it. And like it's an interesting book. The book's called The Maltese Falcon.
Yeah.
And it's like a 1930s detective novel, and it's like interesting because it's like you like hate all the characters essentially because they're all terrible.
Yeah.
Um, but like yeah, like you don't need to show anything or describe anything um, to like use that as like an element in the story.
Mhm.
And like, was it necessary for the story? Like, I'm not necessarily the judge for that, and you know, the author wrote what the author wrote, but it did like display like this is who these characters are.
Mhm.
Um, but then at the same time, it didn't have to describe anything like in detail. That would be scandalizing.
Yeah. You could do that. Like you could hint to or suggest or imply certain actions that do matter for the plot and like yeah, like help tell you who this person is or who that person is, right? Like you don't need to explicitly depict an affair occurring, but you can let us know that one of the characters is like someone who would cheat on their spouse. Like that will move the plot, that will give us a look into this person's character and who they are. But like we don't need to see them actually committing the affair. Um, yeah. So yeah.
Yeah,
I think when it comes to yeah, I think the conversation about sex media is a lot easier because it's just simply don't do it. Um, and you don't lose anything by not doing it. I genuinely, you'd be hard pressed to convince me, not that you would try to convince me of this, but be hard pressed to convince me that if you remove a sex scene from a movie or a television show, the show suffers. I don't think the show would suffer. I don't think the plot would suffer. I legitimately think you do not ever need to show something like that. Um, and it's that's a lot easier. Where as opposed to violence, it's yes, you can also have the mindset of it's all or nothing. Well, you don't. Maybe it's not all or nothing. It's nothing. The mindset is you just don't depict violence. Um, but I think because they're engaging with different parts of our minds, engaging with different parts of our beings, you can have permissible amounts of violence without any sort of negative consequences on the person, on the viewer, whereas you really just can't do that with sexual content at all. Like, yeah, any amount of sexual content is just going to be too much. It's going to do something to you. Um, Yeah, it just a side quick thing. I remember when I was younger, when I was growing up, there was this concerted effort to tie school shootings or just general rises in violence with video games. It wasn't really successful, it never really took off. It wasn't like there was a period of time where everyone was like, "Oh, that's so true." But there was a movement, and there were people that were saying, "Oh, violent video games like something like Grand Theft Auto are enabling people or grooming people to be violent criminals," and that ended up being absolutely not true at all. There's no correlation, um, which I found really funny because yeah, those some of those video games like could get pretty violent, could get pretty gory. But yeah, like I played again, I played a ton of violent video games growing up. I never once had any inkling to go out and commit violence. I never once was like, oh man, this is cool. I should go kill people. Like, it didn't trigger anything in me. It didn't make me want to do violence. It was just very much like, this is its own thing within the context of the video game. I would never do this. Part of the intrigue about doing it is that I would never do it, right? You're like, ooh, I can kind of like do these things, but then also at the same time, I feel guilty about committing crimes in games. Like there's still like a moral push to do good in games, even if there are no real world consequences. Um, but on the flip side, if you look at testimonies some people have shared about when like they're exposed to pornography, things like that, sometimes it's media. Actually, a lot of times it's media that pushes them to that. So they'll say, I saw this scene in this movie or this television show, and it like, I was a young impressionable boy, and so therefore I wanted to see more of that, and so I went online to see more of that, and then blah 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 blah, and now all of a sudden I'm addicted to pornography, right? Like, I think though you can hold those two things at the core of these issues. You can have a kid play hours of violent video games, and there's no correlation that they're going to go out and commit any kind of violence. But on the flip side, if you had that kid play or watch any amount of sexually explicit content, they're going to want more. They're going to go online looking for it, and they're going to find pornography. And that's going to lead to all of its own issues. Um, so that's where I go with this whole like with violence, you can nuance it. With porn or with sexually explicit content, you can't nuance it. It just can't be. It just can't be. And you can maybe argue that sometimes you get to an age or level of maturity where you can like see temporary nudity, or you can like see the sexually explicit scene, and like it's not going to trigger anything for you, and you're not going to like want to go look for more or anything like that. You're just going to move on for your life. Um, but that's a lot harder to get to than the position of, oh, I saw violence, therefore I'm not going to commit violence. Like that's the default. Like, yeah, no one's really going to be motivated to go commit violence because they saw violence on television. But someone probably will be motivated sexually by sexually explicit content on television. Um,
Right. Yeah, to make a metaphor that's totally unnecessary. Um, it's like drinking alcohol or like versus like psychedelic drugs, right? Like you can like drink alcohol in moderation and
yeah,
it won't destroy your life. Um, or like it won't have this like addictive effect or have like an extreme wild effect versus like a psychedelic drug like will have a wild effect on you.
yeah,
Um, like no matter what. And so like you can moderate intake of violence. I don't know if I would recommend like in it's like 20 hours a day of playing violent video games. Like I'm sure that has an effect on you. Uh, but like there can be like like an enjoyment of violence um in moderation and obviously like with some limitation
yeah.
um to it. But yes, like with anything related to like a base desire like sexuality.
Mhm.
Um, of course, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think we're ready, if you are, to
Yeah.
move on to our kind of third piece here, violence in sports. Uh, I would say, particularly in the form of like entertainment sports. Yeah, so like what are your thoughts? Let's start. I think maybe we start with the worst version. Maybe not the worst version, but like the most extreme version. But like
Yeah.
fighting. So like UFC and like MMA. I don't know my terms very well, but like
Yeah.
when you turn on the TV and you watch two people beat each other up, like what do we what do we think about that? Is that okay? Is it not? Like, is there moderation in that? Like, what are your thoughts?
Uh, all right, here's my first thought. I will watch MMA with people. So that's the position I'm going to come from. I think, could be wrong. I think it's okay. There you go, I said it. I I think the thing is, this is one of the tough ones because now we're not talking about depictions of violence. We're talking about actual violence. Like MMA is not a show. It's like actual violence. People are really legitimately committing violence against one another. Um, and this is gonna fall now into the trap of like this consent-based morality, which means as long as the two fighters consent to it, it's okay. It's like, well, we can't agree to that. Like morality can't be exclusively consent-based. Um, it just doesn't work like that. So when it comes to depicting violence, it's not depicting violence, I just choose the words better. When it comes to like committing violence on television for the sake of entertainment, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, I watch it. I don't explicitly condemn it. I'm not a fan of it, if that makes sense. Like I don't follow it really. I don't really follow a certain fighter. I don't really care. Um, but I don't see it as so immoral it can't be watched or so unethical that we like it's not something to even talk about. And the reason for that I think is if we're talking about it can't be moral or can't be justified because the point is to harm the other person and like they're like doing harm to others is like always wrong, then I think we have to take out basically any contact sport like football or rugby, right? Because you could say like, well, the point of those games isn't to hurt the other person. Like maybe that's true, but it's such a significant part of the game. It's necessary. If you remove those parts of the game, like tackling, right? The game's gonna be a mess. Not gonna be good at all. So they're necessary components of the game. So if we can't, again, this goes to the whole thing about like depictions of violence is what's the line? Like it's not just I don't think it's just an easy yes or no, because if it's a no, I think if you're going to be fully bought into the idea of like, no, we shouldn't be watching violence as entertainment, then you need to cut out football, you need to cut out rugby, you need to cut out soccer because they do slide tackles, you need to cut out, hockey because they check each other. Like you need to go full bore with it. So it can't be a yes or no. It's got to be a nuance thing. And if the nuance with UFC is they're just beating each other up, bloodied, a mess. They break bones, they break noses, they get concussions, they get cauliflower ears. I don't know if anyone's actually died in the ring. Maybe. Um, I don't know. I just don't think you could. I don't think you could say no to that. I don't think you can make it a blanket. No, this is immoral. Shouldn't happen. Don't watch it. I think you can have again an aesthetic distaste for it, as in that's kind of uncouth. That's kind of barbaric. I don't want to expose myself to that. I don't want to expose my family to that. And I think you're fine to say that. But I don't think we can get to a point of saying, no, this isn't permissible at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is a tough one. I think pieces of it are like I agree, like I'm not interested in it.
Mhm.
And like it's also like I don't know. I think there are nuances in the fighting, like professional fighting world that I don't understand.
Mhm.
Right? Like I've seen Rocky, uh, and like boxing seems to be kind of a different thing. Like you just
Yeah.
punch.
Yeah.
I yeah, and there's like more kind of limitations to it versus I know there are types of fighting that are like just do whatever you can to beat the other person up. Um, but like if boxing's okay, like is it really like I don't know. Like obviously don't kill the guy, right? Like I don't know. Like I feel like I think it is a tough one. I think to roll it back, like you're saying, like there has to be some level of consistency in it between, other physical sports and something like
Mhm.
fighting. But like I would like to roll it back to something that's uh more understandable. Like looking at something like football,
Mhm.
like there is, yeah, like there's something like admirable about people that are like there's strategy level of football and all this other stuff, but like there is something just innately admirable of like these men like work to perfect their like bodies and to train their bodies to be better than the other players' bodies. And so
Mhm.
like you see like again like maybe a more understandable thing like two like a receiver and a defender like going for a catch, a ball that's thrown trying to catch it, and like there is something like wow, like you watch it in slow mo, like look at the control this player has as
Mhm.
they catch the ball and they maneuver their hand to catch it in a way that the other player can't. um and then like to go to step further, like a player's trying to tackle the quarterback and you have sort of like a defensive lineman blocking him, and like there is like you watch the same thing in slow mo, like you can like look at like the way he kind of maneuvers around the defensive lineman to tackle the court, like like there's something that's like okay, like he knows how to like best the other player physically.
Yep.
And like that's like okay, like that's cool, like that's like almost an art form. And so like the same thing with like boxing. Like yeah, it's like he knows how to best the other play. He knows like what the guy's thinking and like how to draw him to like defend his lower section of his body, and so then you have a shot at like the upper section. Like that's like yeah, like there's like it's like a sport, like it like what that's what it is. It's a sport.
Yeah.
And so there's something like there's like strategy and like obviously like he's physically stronger than that guy, and so like but then like oh but he's using his smaller body because he's faster and like all this stuff that's like oh it's like exciting, and it's interesting and it's like admirable. um yeah, but there is like a point to which like some of this stuff that I've seen, and it's like this is like like this is brutal, like they're just like hitting
Yeah.
each other and
Yep.
there's blood everywhere, and it's like is this I don't know, like there's a certain point it's like what's that. I want to say Potter, but I could be totally wrong. But one of the Supreme Court justices, when like back to the pornography thing, but like
Yeah.
when he talked about like pornography, he said like pornography versus like art. I don't know totally the context of it. This was like in the 60s. They were like trying to come up with obscenity tests. But like on one of the
Yep.
rulings, he's quoted saying, I know it when I see it, like talking
Mhm.
about like
Mhm.
pornography of like there's a sense to which like even with fighting, like there's a point to which it's like this feels like this is not what our society should be doing.
Mhm.
Um, and I think maybe that's more of my point. Like, I don't know if I feel comfortable making like a moral judgment about fighting, or about certain levels of professional fighting, but
Yeah.
more of like what is good for society. Like, I don't think it's good for society to just be watching people like destroy each other on television. Versus like in some ways, like I think watching another sport like football, where it's like it's still very physical and like somewhat violent, but like the purpose is more, it's more about the ball and about moving and about that strategy. Like maybe that's like better for society than something like just rooting for people to beat each other up. But
Mhm.
even then, like I do see how they're so connected because so much of football is like just tackle the quarterback, right? So
Yeah.
there's like that level to it. I don't know.
Yeah. 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 It's just a matter of that's yeah. I think it's a good point of like I'll know it when I see it. There is a sense with UFC and MMA. It's like this just reminds me of like gladiator battles in like ancient Rome. What now with those there was like life or death on purpose. Um. So it wasn't just hey I'm gonna beat him up I win great. It's I'm killing this person like that's it. And that's certainly you can definitely make that argument of like that's immoral and shouldn't happen ever again. Um. but I don't know, man. Just two dudes beating up each other. Like isn't that isn't that just what guys are gonna do? Boys gonna be boys, just beating each
Right.
other up. I don't know. Yeah, it's I don't know. I don't know. It's not so easy to claim one or the other. I'm sure there are some people who are more confident in the answers, and so they'll say like for sure, like no, this is absolutely wrong. You can't watch UFC, and that's happened uh previously as my role as Focus Mystery years ago, where there was one of the big fights, big name fights that was happening, and you definitely got invited to this event. I don't know if you came to the event, and there was a debate with my teammate. It was a small debate. It wasn't like an actual argument or anything like that. But I was like, "Hey, I think we should host a UFC game, get some guys over, watch it, have a party. That'd be great." And he goes, "Can you ask our chaplain what he thinks?" Because he had heard that UFC, like my teammate had heard that like MMA and UFC is immoral and you shouldn't watch it at all. And I was like, "I've never heard that before. Let me do some research into this." And so I asked the chaplain, and he was like, "It's whatever." Actually, I think he came to the fight too. Uh, so that's one thing. But um, yeah, like just looking online, and it's just there's no consensus to it. It's not obvious. At most you get people that say like, "Oh, we just prudently shouldn't watch violent depiction or violent acts against one another." Like it's a prudential judgment as opposed to a moral imperative. And so I don't know. I have a quick. So I was looking at or obscenity laws because the U.S. technically has obscenity laws on the books, um, and to hit the obscenity laws, you need to hit a few things, but they're pretty ambiguous because one of the last ones is like the general public has to agree that this is obscene, and I think this goes to like what I was saying earlier, which hey, 25 years ago the what we considered violent and sexually explicit 25 years ago is nothing compared to what's accepted nowadays. Um, and so I think the I don't know, bad part of obscenity laws, maybe just like an unhelpful part of the obscenity laws is they're not objective. They're inherently relativistic to the culture, um, which may make sense if that's what you're trying to go for. But I think if you're actually trying to hold people to a moral standard, moral standards don't actually change. Like morality does not change. It can change. Um, but that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is I was reading a quote from um, okay, so there was this so I clicked on the obscenity law stuff and they were like, here's the first case in the US, like where it's a big deal. So it's like the 1800s and in Massachusetts, this guy printed quote a lewd and obscene novel. So it's basically like a pornographic novel, right? And he appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Court saying, "Hey, like that's not justified. Like they haven't even seen the book. Like, First Amendment, blah blah blah." The Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1821 said that this guy who printed a lewd and obscene novel, quote, was a scandalous and evil disposed person who had contrived to debauch and corrupt the citizens of Massachusetts and to raise and create in their minds inordinate and lustful desires.
Oh, that's so based.
That is what a Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court said about someone who tried publishing a pornographic novel. If
Oh,
we ha we
we
should
should
go
print
back
that
to
on
that.
t-shirts.
That's what we should.
That's
Like that
awesome.
that's what it used to be considered. Like that was the like it's not just, hey, no, you can't do that. It's obscene. Sorry, man. It's literally like you are an evil disposed person whose only purpose is to corrupt the citizens of this state because he was producing pornography. Imagine if we had that same gusto behind our anti-pornography push. This is going to get into another whole thing for me, so I'm not going to go down this road in this episode. But we've lost a lot trying to soften our words in our anti things because no one's going to respect you if you're just being honest. But like this, I saw that. I was like, that's such a good quote.
That's awesome.
It's so awesome. Scandalous and evil disposed person.
I
Oh,
have that's awesome. I have two final thoughts on
yeah, go ahead.
the uh fighting thing. Um First thought is like in football, right? Like obviously like there are rules to like when you can tackle somebody and you know what a tackle should look like and all this.
Yeah.
But like for example, like Patrick Mahomes, like the entire country hates Patrick Mahomes. Um and so
Yes.
like if there's like a late hit on Patrick Mahomes, you
Hmm.
know, that's like a penalty, right? Like it's against the rules.
Hmm.
Um like or like, you know, like a dangerous hit or something that would be against the rules. Like I would say like the crowd would cheer. Like the general public would be excited by that late hit, right? Because like so many people just have ill wish towards Patrick Mahomes and they see like him getting hit as like justice, whether or not like it's within the rules of the game. So I do think like that is maybe like a point against football of
Hmm.
like yes, like the purpose of the game is not to like hit people, like it's to, you know, score points and all this. Um and like hitting people is like exciting within sort of the structure and the rules of the game. But even outside of it, like people are happy to see Patrick Mahomes get hit. And so like I think that's maybe like, yeah, that's an example of like this is like the violence is sort of like in like overwhelming or like the excitement of the violence becomes more of the point of the sport to some people. Um my second thought would be this, maybe a question for you, I guess. Um So like you said, like boys will be boys. They beat each other up. Like that's how it goes. Um, which like I kind of agree with. But like, how do you feel about like women in professional fighting?
Hmm.
Like, do you think that that is immoral or something that we should be allowing in our society? What are your thoughts of that?
All right, so I'm going to get accused of sexism. I don't think women should be participating in violent sports at all.
Yeah, I
Done.
don't think
Full
so either.
stop. Just take it away. That's not the role of a woman. See, all right. For men, there is an inherent role we fill in protectors, right, in fighters. In women, it is not the case. So it is unbecoming of a woman to act in such a way, where it is not inherently unbecoming of a man to act violently.
Right.
How
And
the
I
violence done is one thing, but violence in itself is not unbecoming in a man.
right. And I think back to sort of at least where I landed with the sports things of like
Mm.
with you know professional fighting like is this something that we as a society like think is good to expose you know people to in our society or like something that's good that people should be enjoying as entertainment
Yeah.
um and I would say like I don't know maybe to professional fighting with men but to professional fighting with women I'd say definitely not like this is not
Yeah.
how we should be viewing women like this is not the context um that
Exactly.
we should be thinking about women of like them being beat up. Um, yeah, it's
Yeah.
just not.
Yeah.
It's not how like we should be thinking about women as like women should be protected, not as
Yep.
women should be beat up. Which yeah, I'm sure we'll get some people that would accuse us of sexism, but I think the circles that people would listen to this podcast in are not necessarily.
The current sphere of influence we have are
Yeah,
people that agree with us, so we're
yeah,
not too concerned. All right. Some good questions, some good conversation. People in the comments, you leave your thoughts on things like UFC and women participating in violent sports and depictions of things in television and media. And we didn't talk about music at all. I mentioned it in the beginning, and you said that's a great idea. We didn't touch it on at all. That's all right. Violence is depicted in music, shouldn't be. There you go. I said it. All right. The glorification of violence shouldn't be depicted in music. There you go. All right. Well, I'm Rob,
and I'm Ben.
and this has been
Podcast. Oh
No,
my gosh,
you
that
did
was our
it.
old podcast. Oh golly. This has been Analog Catholic.